私のポケットモンスターと勝負しない？
あんただーれ？
モンスター全部で150種類。通信ケーブルでモンスター取り替えっこ。スーパーゲームボーイならカラーで綺麗。仲間が増えるロールプレイング。ポケットモンスター。赤を買うか緑を買うかちょっと違うよ。
This video was originally going to be an hour-long deep dive into what makes the new Digimon game work so well, why it was fundamentally different from other JRPGs, and how that subgenre of monster catching games really worked within the fact that Pokemon was at its apex in that genre. I'm still going to be doing that Digimon piece in its own video, because it not only deserves to be, but I also think this video about Pokemon and Pokemon ZA specifically deserves to be its own video and script as well. So with that being said, bear with me, as this video is going to be pretty in-depth in terms of discussing game design and Pokemon game design specifically. So with that said, you've read the title, let's get started. This video is going to try and primarily answer 3 questions. The first is how Pokemon was able to become the biggest franchise in the world. The second is why the Pokemon games work so well where others have failed. And the third, answering the title, how or why does the new Pokemon game, Legends ZA, destroy the fabric of what makes those Pokemon games special? Part 1, Pokemon Dominance. In order to understand how the new Pokemon Legends game fundamentally destroys the fabric and identity of what a Pokemon game is, we first need to get to grips with what makes a Pokemon game work in the first place, which means mostly understanding what makes Pokemon anything work. So let's start from the beginning. The Pokemon games themselves are, in the broadest sense, Japanese RPGs or JRPGs with collectible monsters as its focal party members. But putting any monster catching game, including Pokemon, in that box is not really descriptive of what these games are. I'm going to be referring to any monster catching games, including Pokemon, as MCs from now on, as it's a little bit easier and less repetitive. I will still be mentioning Pokemon specifically whenever needed to call out when that specific game is responsible for something. But generally, MCs from the start need to rely on things like the quality of their monster designs, their personalities, and their team building, with later and more advanced MCs also needing things like good monster discoverability, good combat, and expressions to really work. They need these elements because the more traditional aspects of RPGs we've come to expect, like things like world building, characters, side quests, and grandiose stories, are not something that MCs tend to care about all that much. It's hard to really pinpoint why, but oftentimes it can be attributed to the scope of what you have to build. If the focus of these games is on the monsters, then that's what has to get the most attention, right? RPGs and JRPGs tend to focus on things like their worlds and the world building and the role-playing aspects in that. Obviously, in a perfect world, both would be highlighted, but most companies do not have the kind of budget or time to do that. And so, as games like Final Fantasy or Tales of went full cinematic storytelling and characters as their approach to RPGs, early monster catching games like Digimon Adventure, Pokemon, original Pokemon games, Monster Rancher series, and early SMT Digital Devil Saga leaned into the personality-driven monster approach, which not only worked well with younger audiences, but was also a very nice change of pace. It also let them be a little bit more approachable too, as the early games were a lot more pet simulator and virtual pet Tamagotchi style ones, and less so complex strategy games. And so I think what that started to do is it began with the idea that if these games sold well, and Pokemon did, and Digimon to some capacity also did as well early on, that it didn't need to compete with JRPGs or RPGs in the traditional sense as a whole, and could kind of become its own thing. Interestingly, in this kind of subgenre of monster catcher games, a lot of IPs start to form. You got Pokemon, Digimon, SMT, kind of like the big 3, but there's a lot of other varieties of smaller ones and other adjacent properties that try to get into the monster catcher field. So at this point, in the early 90s, there's a lot of IPs and franchises that have now been established into this new and experimental subgenre. So obviously, at some point, one of these is going to break out into some kind of crazy mass appeal. Of course, that's not necessarily specifically needed because a lot of genres today are able to kind of work within their little niche audiences and sustain themselves, but as we know, that was not the path that this subgenre was going to take. Talking about Pokemon specifically now, Pokemon is really a one-of-a-kind monster catcher. One that is, at least early on, more casual and kid-friendly. It also, I would say, is the best one that can be easily adapted to other mediums, as the original games and even the sequels were primarily on, primitive, either colored Game Boys or non-colored Game Boys, the originals, there's quite a lot of opportunities for these creatures to come to life. The universe that Pokemon creates is its own franchise in itself, which is also why it's handled by different companies. But regardless of its making, it's clear that the players wanted to see these creatures come to life in a way that the games really weren't able to do at this time. This is why, smartly, just a year after the Gen 1 released in Japan in 1996, we got the Pokemon anime, which critically has stayed consistent roughly to the games for the last 28 years. What this coordination did was let players experience the games with a full degree of realization, with things like voice acting, more expressive Pokemon, colors, stories. Directly tied the Pokemon of the new games with the anime releases, meaning it created that connected world that you could be a part of. It's a really genius move that's often overlooked when you talk about Pokemon success. It wasn't that it was just a good game of likable pets on a relatively cheap portable system. It was that it also tied directly into the game world to a more fleshed out living one on TV. You could play the games and then get excited about how the anime would adapt that region, Pokemon, and themes of the game into a more serialized story format. I wanted to highlight that connection here because I think it's really important to kind of understanding that Pokemon didn't just come from the games, it came from that connection to the Pokemon universe, which was held both by the games and the anime. That's why, as you see in the background here, there's a lot of commercials that are relating to, the feeling that Pokemon have come into the real world, right? It's not just showcasing the game, it's showcasing the Pokemon franchise and how they're able to interact with humans, right? And interact with buses and just be a little bit more connected in a way that most other IPs just weren't at that time. I would also say that linked nature would pretty much stay true until present day, with various spin-offs accompanying the main series, right? Pokemon Journeys on Netflix and the various Netflix Pokemon series and movies, as well as the yearly movie releases that add a little bit more of a flair. It is interesting to note that the anime actually predates the first games released in the US, with the anime premiering in September of 1998 and the games following a couple weeks later. Due to things like the anime tie-in, the trading card game the following year in '99, the Game Boy Color, I believe, or Game Boy Advance version of the trading card game a year past that, and the spin-off Pokemon Stadium in the year 2000, there were at least one or two things every single year that were Pokemon related. It made it extremely easier and accessible to be a Pokemon fan, even if you didn't specifically like the Pokemon games themselves. I kind of established all this setup to say that there's a lot of external factors when trying to understand what made Pokemon work. Not to say that the games weren't good enough to do that on their own, but a lot of that early success that Pokemon had compared to others, and then more importantly its staying power, is built on the backs of this new ecosystem. I am, however, going to leave most of the ecosystem behind and fast forward a bit here. As Pokemon has become an established gaming franchise and a system seller, we have to really examine why for almost 20 years now, the standard catching, training, and battling parts of the formula have stayed pretty much unchanged. Other MCs like Digimon experimented wildly with the roguelike monster raising Digimon World series, the more story RPG-centric story series, and things like the visual novel and light novel spin-offs. SMT Shin Megami Tensei leaned into a more old-school dungeon crawling aesthetic. Monster Rancher went for a more virtual pet sitting life sim aesthetic. And while Pokemon has mainly stuck with its tried-and-true format game after game. Obviously, there's a lot of Pokemon spin-offs and a lot of experiments, like the Pokemon Ranger series, and a lot of games that were co-developed with Bandai Namco or other creators like PokePark, Pokemon Rumble, Pokemon Coliseum, Pokemon Snap, Mystery Dungeon, right? But I would say the key differences between these things and the other ones that the competitors were doing is really in resources. For the most part, and this isn't true all the time, but broadly speaking, there is not a main Digimon game or a main SMT game. There's varieties of Digimon games, varieties of SMT games, and because they're not releasing super frequently, functionally, whatever the newest game in that series is mostly the mainline game, right? For the most part, the budget and the time allocation and the development cycle for a Digimon or SMT game is roughly the same throughout most of these games. There isn't really a Digimon game that's like, oh, this is the main of the series, right? That kind of thing. Pokemon, however, is quite different. Pokemon can have wildly different marketing and development budgets depending on if it's a spin-off or if it's a main game. For example, for marketing, there are very few ads for a new Ranger game, but there's an avalanche for the Diamond and Pearl game that came out that same year, for the anime tie-in, for the trading card games, for the merchandise. And that is because, unlike Digimon or SMT, the scale at which Pokemon operated made those spin-offs or experiments not really worth doing. I guess a good way to showcase this is with sales data. So case in point, the Pokemon Ranger game in 2006 sold about 2.9 million units. All the units I'm going to be mentioning are units to date, just for reference. So 2.9 million units. That is in the same year that Pokemon Diamond and Pearl released, and that was a relatively exciting launch for that generation, but it wasn't super crazy, right? It was an evolution on Gen 3. It wasn't some crazy turnaround. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl sold 17 million units. The follow-up Rangers game sold slightly more, about 3.1 million units. That was also the same year that Pokemon Platinum, over a year after Diamond and Pearl had released, and Pokemon Platinum and Emerald as well are enhanced versions of the original games, so they're kind of like, hey, a definitive version of the game is out a year later, right? Even that version, Pokemon Platinum, sold 7.6 million units. A third Pokemon game released over a year and a half after the hype of the original games sold at least double a new Pokemon Ranger game sold, even after it was established that Pokemon Ranger was a good franchise and that you should be picking up that game, right? A similar example happened with the Mystery Dungeon series, co-developed by Spike Chunsoft. The Mystery Dungeon game that year did a little bit better. It was Explorers of the Sky, which was a enhanced version of Explorers of Darkness and Explorers of Time. All three of those games combined, the data we have is it sold about 6 million units. That is still 3 games worth of sales data, where a mainline title that year it did 3 times that, right? And so because of that, we now have to ask and figure out what makes the Pokemon games, the mainline ones, specifically work. Because whether or not we realize it as we've gone through this here, the other spin-off games and the other Pokemon things that are not mainline entries don't make that much money, right? The anime tie-in is mostly just there to add flavor and add universe to the Pokemon stuff. That, at least according to the sales charts, hasn't made $1 billion yet, and it's been going on the air for like 25 years, right? 30 years. Versus the mainline series, which has made $16 billion, as you can see from the chart here, right? Things like the TCG are a little bit better. They are, however, still kind of based on the games. That sold about 30 billion, which is just 2 billion shy of all the games, including spin-offs. Like we mentioned, they don't make a ton of money. And, more importantly, as of recently, it includes things like the free-to-play titles, Pokemon Unite and Cafe Mix and yada yada, right? So even the free-to-play Pokemon games that make buckets of money, combined with the mainline series that also sell very well, and the spin-offs, just make barely more than the trading cards, right? So clearly this tells us something. It says that the games themselves and the game design philosophy here is really irresistible to players, because it's effectively able to shove most of the Pokemon franchise, games-wise, into a relatively functional stratosphere, right? If it didn't, if the games weren't as successful as they end up being, I could see Pokemon being a substantially less as big franchise in terms of games and focus way more on the trading cards, because that's where you see a lot of money, right? Trading cards are the second biggest thing, other than merch, that Pokemon has if the games end up faltering at any point, right? So now we have to ask ourselves for part 2 here, what makes Pokemon work? This subgenre to really work, and this is kind of where we're going to get into like the game design analysis, so just stick with me for a second here. For this subgenre to work, it really needs to nail 3 things. Number 1, the team building. Number 2, the discovery of the monsters. And number 3, the combat. As I mentioned before, 2 of these things become important sort of later on in the life cycle. The combat does not need to be that deep, because the variety of Pokemon and moves made it so that experimenting with things like combinations were fun in their own right. The discovery doesn't need to be anything crazy, because just the idea of 151 collectible and trainable creatures was enough to getting people to want to catch them all. But as the games have gone on with the same catching, battling, and discovery mechanics for the last 20 years or so, obviously you're going to need more emphasis on the depth of the combat and discovery. I'm going to be mentioning Pokemon here first, because obviously it's a pretty simpler example. I could talk about Shin Megami Tensei, but I think that, with the changes that they're in and the complexities, we can do that. I think it's easier to focus on the one that ended up being a little bit more successful, and I may save the other comparisons or the other explanations for a different video that I'll do another time. But overall, I'm going to be talking about the Pokemon monster catching mechanics specifically, and why it nails what it's doing. So Pokemon, broadly speaking, has always been about team building and discovery. The idea that you are in a world of magical creatures that you can discover and catch and train to be your own. Each game is a new region filled with new Pokemon moves and enemies. Its quintessential strengths tend to be things like its monster personalities, designs, and the team building mechanics with all the things that entails. No other series is really able to combine the personality of Pokemon with the sheer number of Pokemon that has been in the mainline games, and to the quality that they have generally been able to achieve with that. And I would say that, while the technical aspects of Pokemon can be quite complex, the battling themselves is relatively simple, right? Which also, I think, ideally lets both sides of the player base feel respected. And this is kind of talking about the team building aspects, right? Kids who want to use their favorite Pokemon and moves are still able to participate in multiplayer battles and have fun, while people that want to dig into the competitive scene, it allows more invested players to experiment with team compositions and synergies. A good example here is Pokemon Showdown. This is a web-based Pokemon battle simulator that's been going on since about 2012, and it is all about competitive battling with things like very detailed move descriptions for how Pokemon operates that are way different and way more in-depth than something like the main game can offer. There's a lot of concepts you can go through, like stab, damage rolls, nature breeding for perfect IVs, right? Everything like that is available if you want to get invested into it. So in terms of team building, Pokemon's really able to nail the use of its systems in terms of like its abilities and items and movesets and breeding and natures and stuff, all to really combine to make a really interesting and engaging way to build your team. If you want me to go a little bit more in depth on that, I'd recommend watching some people do competitive Pokemon on stuff like Pokemon Showdown if you want to get sort of like hands-on on how that actually affects battling. I won't be going into too much of that here just because I'm trying to make this understandable to someone that maybe doesn't have a ton of Pokemon experience, because again, these games can get quite complex in terms of theory and stuff, so I'm leaving it on the relatively simpler side. But if you want to check out people playing Pokemon Showdown or other competitive Pokemon players to maybe get that side a little bit more hands-on, I'd recommend doing that if you're interested. So, but I would say on the discovery side of it now, the recent games have taken a more grounded approach, where you can see things like Pokemon wandering the world, with things like different sizes or variants, which add a lot of variety to the mix. Every section of the new region houses different Pokemon. There's a day and night cycle, which can showcase Pokemon that only appear during certain times of days. The newer elements like things like raid battles in Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet add a level of boss challenge and mystery, with a focus on hunting for things like the highest rarity or shinies. And so overall, the discovery of the recent Pokemon games is all about seeing them in the wild, being able to catch them, throw a ball at them, or battle them in kind of your own space and your own time. It's a system that I think works really well and is overall a massive improvement from the older game's random encounter style model. Talking about a game that's a little bit different and a little bit more modern that I also think nails this, to just mention that, it's not just Pokemon that's able to succeed in this, but primarily Pokemon is the one that succeeds in it the best and is the one that is able to generate the most buzz around it. But another game I think that does both these things quite well is Palworld. Without getting too deep into it, because I already made a video on Palworld, I think Palworld has that really good balance between both its team building and discovery. So much of the pals have personality to them with their designs and animations, the way they're able to work both at the base and how they affect the things like the moves in the open world. It has some great micromanagement stuff that you can do at the base, and due to its open world, it can make things like discovering new pals very exciting, because that is a main factor to explore the world. Similar to Scarlet and Violet or other Pokemon games like the Stadium games, not Stadium games. Similar to, I guess, Ranger and some other ones that have a little bit more open zone-based structure. This has, pals in different biomes, shinies, variants. All that stuff kind of leads you to have a quite exciting time if you want to explore and discover all the pals, which tends to be a very good sticking point, right? A lot of people play these games just to catch them all. So obviously, Palworld is a survival game, so it's not going to be to everyone's cup of tea, but it's definitely a good example. And so while I would say Palworld and Pokemon are able to really nail these fundamental pillars, a lot of other MCs, and especially modern ones, really fail to capture that same spark. It's part of the reason I think that Pokemon stays on top. It's because nothing else has really bothered to challenge what I believe Pokemon is doing. I would say that this lack of understanding about what the subgenre needs to thrive is often where the newer entries in the genre fail. They try and do things to improve aspects that they see as lacking, whether that be its world, characters, battling, or social elements, without building a solid foundation or even understanding what makes Pokemon work. I'll give a couple of examples here. While I liked Monster Hunter Stories 2 a lot, it also was a very combat-centric game and had issues with how monsters were discovered and leveled. Things like Temtem tried adding more combat depth, but forgot that all the depth in the world can't save its horrible level design and random encounters from feeling like a chore. This design makes it pretty much impossible to want to explore and discover new Temtem, and that made it quite painful to do and play the game. Cassette Beast is a game I also quite enjoyed for things like its atmosphere and laid-back exploration. However, it failed to give a compelling reason to want to manage and build up your team. There wasn't enough going on with the beasts themselves to make for an interesting mid to end game. I could go on, but pretty much the point is that even great games in this genre aren't doing what Pokemon succeeds at, and that's what I think a lot of other people wanted from these games. And the reason is because it ultimately came back to those three elements and pillars of team building, discovery, and battling, which are all that matters to me and to a lot of other people. So, if the game can nail those three elements, it's pretty much irrelevant whether the world building is, for example, is up to par as you would hope to with other games like Metaphor, right? It's not really competing in that space anymore if it focuses on the things that I think bring a lot of unique quality to these games. Hopefully, in this lead up to the game, and talking about the game, I've been able to demonstrate how Pokemon got to be the biggest franchise in the world by utilizing its universe, why the Pokemon games work so well, and where others have failed in it. So with that being said, with the groundwork laid, we can finally start talking about the actual game we're here to talk about. Part 3, ZA destroys the fabric of Pokemon. Alright, so as a lifelong Pokemon fan, someone who has bought and played every new game, and most of the remakes, barring the Gen 4 remake and the Gen 1 second remakes, the games have gone significantly downhill since coming to the Switch. But even then, I still quite enjoyed Scarlet and Violet for its open world approach, with its multiple segmented goals, which ended up coalescing into a final goal at the center of the universe that was quite nice. It was also a good change of pace from what people had complained about Sword and Shield's linearity to be, and to me, personally, it gave a little bit more of a focused experience than something like Legends Arceus was able to provide. However, various issues relating to performance and visuals and the end game really left me feeling shortchanged from something truly great, especially when it came to the fact that that was sold separately for $35 as DLC later on. I've since 2022 tried to fill that void with games like Temtem, Cassette Beast, Nexomon, Koromon, a couple of the older Digimon games, Monster Hunter Stories, and others. And I think that I'm just setting this up to say I'm a lifelong Pokemon fan, that's what I've been interested in, and that's where I'm kind of coming from. If you want my opinion on what the best one is, I think Sun and Moon was probably the best game. A close second would be Black and White 2, specifically. I did enjoy X and Y. I technically had the most time in X and Y, but I definitely think Sun and Moon is a better game in that regard, and probably my favorite of the series if you're trying to gauge where I fall on that. However, at this point in the original script, I would have started talking about Digimon, because this was supposed to be a Digimon talking about how good that game is in relation to Pokemon, but talking about where that stands in kind of the JRPG versus Monster Hunter discussion, right? However, if I did that in this video, it would take another 40 minutes because of how long that script ended up being. So if you want to hear me talk about Digimon and how great that game is and just how interesting it is and what it's doing to the genre, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you're interested in that, or if you're just interested in hearing about cool hidden gems or other deep dives like this. I try to post about a new game every single week. But anyways, thank you for doing that, and back on topic here. So pretty much we're trying to examine why ZA doesn't work at all and kind of destroys the fabric. But you kind of have to understand where my headspace is in at this point. So the new Pokemon game at this point is a couple weeks from launch on October 16th. And I have not been convinced at this point by any of the trailers or promotional materials that this game has that it's going to be exciting, as it is not that interesting to me currently. I'm even less convinced because I decided to buy the new Digimon game instead and played that a bit before it came out a couple weeks earlier. Due to both of these factors, I played most of Legends ZA on an emulator, which means two things. First off, I technically played the Switch 1 version with a 60 FPS mod at 1440p with SMA anti-aliasing. That's important to note because it will look, technically speaking, I think a little bit better than what a standard native 1080p output would be. It also means that a lot of the footage you're going to be seeing here does have some graphical glitches relating to texture pop-in, which is annoying but not groundbreaking. There are things I do not know how Nintendo is about showing emulated gameplay, especially when it has things like graphical bugs, since that would not be present in the retail release. So pretty much all this to say, do not take the ZA gameplay you see here as a definitive or representative value of how the game is. The game on official hardware does not have a lot of these visual bugs that you're seeing in the game with random texture pop-ins and flickering assets and stuff. So just keep that in mind, that what you're seeing here is not representative of the quality of a lot of the visual aspects of the game. Just to lay that out there, big warning ahead of time, as when I show this is not running on technically official hardware, right? So there might be some issues there. Alright, so I saved this section on the actual game in the title of the video for last, because most of my thoughts can be summarized in other people's reviews. Mr. Manny Plays Retro Rebound channel has a video on the game, a review, and Zeostorm's video as well. Both of those pretty much encapsulate my thoughts on the overall feelings I have on the game. And I don't want to take away from anyone watching those videos, especially Zeostorm's, as he doesn't usually cover Pokemon, and he did make a fantastic explainer exposing a lot of the things that I will be mentioning in the next couple paragraphs. With that said, I think the fundamental issue ultimately comes down with how the new game gets rid of the most critical elements of a good Pokemon experience. As we have painstakingly established in Part 1 and Part 2, Pokemon works due to its connection from the games to the broader Pokemon universe, and its focus on team building, discovery, and combat mechanics where other games are not successful in those elements. However, unfortunately, I am sad to report that both sides of that coin here are non-existent in the newest entries. Alright, I have a lot of examples here, and I have a lot of footage here to show off the examples, so bear with me. Due to the fact that this is technically a spin-off game, it will not get its own anime, or movie, or trading card set, or collaborations, or merch. This makes it immediately less interesting and connected than the mainline titles for a lot of people. However, that is not necessarily needed to have a great game. Arceus, the previous Legends game, didn't have any of that, and it became the highest rated modern Pokemon game. The spin-offs never had anything like that and were very successful. But ZA really feels like even a backstep from those entries. It feels even more reductive and sterile. Without a broader link to anything else, it becomes extremely hard to have any feelings for the world that this game is portraying. You may have noticed, world design is not one of the 3 pillars. However, there is something that I definitely did leave out when talking about the pillars. The world of Pokemon doesn't need to matter. It doesn't need to make sense, it doesn't need to have structure. But it does need to make sense to the people in Pokemon. Monster catchers don't need world building, but they do need a world. They need to have a place to establish towns and areas and shops. It doesn't need to make sense to us. It doesn't need to make, logical sense or structural sense. It can be gamey, it can be blocked off, but it needs to make sense to the people in it. The worlds of Pokemon need to be thematically consistent to the people living in it. Sword and Shield's England, for example, doesn't make sense. It's inconsistent in tone and structure, the buildings are all over the place, it's blocked by random Pokemon all the time, it's very linear, right? It doesn't make a ton of sense. But it is real to the people in that world. The characters and the shopkeepers exist. They take up space, they have a place to exist in. Pokemon Legends ZA has none of that. In ZA, a shopkeeper will stand outside their store, say it's closed, and let you order off the menu to get items. That is not a world or a place, it's a vending machine as a person. Pretty much anything else you can point to has that same level of disconnect. People stand in the street constantly, facing buildings to nothing, or facing lampposts or other things just randomly out in the street, or just basically T-pose at you if you're not directly looking at them. Pokemon roam around the city or stand still, going into nothing. There are random Megastones littered throughout the city with no benefit other than to the player. Clothing shops are just digital billboards you can buy from. Going into them just opens up a menu. There are about 2 buildings in the entire game that are not store related, the hotel and the restaurant model, that can be entered and explored for the most part. And there's 3 examples here that I really want to highlight, which I have footage of, to talk about the lacking quality of this world. The first is that unlike much of the previous Pokemon games for things like Pokémon Centers, this game doesn't even let you see what Pokemon are being healed. It's a small cubicle, a blue light, and it's done. In past games like Sword and Shield, you saw the Pokemon 3D model being healed. You saw the Pokéshops, items in the background, all that. That add a level of personality and a level of place that this game just doesn't have. There is no personality there. We'll come back to that. The second example is in this car lot. It's an unmarked part of the map with 3 taxis in it. You talk to a driver and it can teleport you anywhere you need. The issue is that not only can you already do this from the map, but even if you wanted to go to this, again, unmarked location to teleport somewhere, why would you need 3 drivers directly next to each other to do that? If there was a mechanical benefit, like them being able to take you to different locations, or a world benefit, like sometimes they won't be there because they're taking other NPCs, then it makes sense. But these 3 are going to stay here in the exact same spot for you specifically, meaning the whole idea is irrelevant since you'll never need to use them in the first place. Final example related to the one building you can enter, that's not the main one. Restaurants in this game are, well, restaurants if you can call them that, are one single model, color swap depending on the star level, and get this, for the most part they're not actually usable. At least so far, you can't order anything. The host at the front doesn't pop up menu, the waiters don't, the people outside don't, nothing. It's a random building, color swapped for fun, I guess. I do want to note that, during the process of making this script and doing things like that, there is a point where I think you do get access to a couple of the restaurants, but getting access to the restaurant just means beating them in a battle and then you have access to the menu. But any other point you don't have access to the menu, it's not a real restaurant. It's a story-locked side quest, effectively, to get access to a restaurant. It's ridiculous. It's really criminal how much life is taken out of even the little things in this game. This stuff is why the game doesn't feel alive. This stuff is the thing that makes games feel alive. It's what actual people are doing and not just a menu. Again, as I mentioned, you don't need world building or interesting characters, but you do need a world and character, and ZA doesn't have either of these. I also want to be clear that this isn't like a known Gamefreak issue, by the way. They have many times made worlds and characters and settings that work even in their limited scope. Houses and forts and lakes and caves and meadows, anything. Here's some examples. Diamond and Pearl Lake Verity at the start, even in the shitty Gen 4 remakes, has a vibe and has a place. Black and White New York, Sword and Shield Battle Stadium, even Scarlet and Violet's Indigo Disc DLC area has a place. ZA doesn't. ZA is just a poorly done city with people statically moving around, barely, Pokemon out wherever they feel like it. It doesn't feel lived at all. I'm not saying lived in, I'm saying lived. These aren't characters or people or anything. Every previous game, even Scarlet and Violet, felt like it had more of a place than this game does. On that note, I would happily take a Gen 10 with a fixed camera again if it means actual effort goes into any kind of scene composition at all. So beyond the connection to the issues to the world I have, which is a lot more about world design, we go back to the 3 pillars. And this is where I'd actually recommend watching Zeostorm's video for a more complete breakdown of everything that doesn't work in terms of the first 2, things like battling and catching side of the game. It's only 10 minutes and does actually give great examples. But to not leave you with nothing, a large part of why the battling and catching doesn't work centers around the lack of danger. I would recommend watching his video if you want more on that side. I, however, will be focusing on the team building pillar here, since that is something he doesn't really go over. As mentioned previously, team building in Pokemon works due to the large array of Pokemon, items, moves, abilities, and team compositions. ZA gets rid of everything but the Pokemon. Moves don't matter since you should just use whatever the strongest move is and then switch out. Remember, there are no turns here. You can simply use a Mega Move, then swap to another Pokemon to use their Mega Move. There's also no penalty for using a bad move, as you can just swap out again before it becomes an issue. The risk of using a bad move before in previous games was that it can take a turn away from your options. The entire point of a turn-based system broadly, especially one in Pokemon, is that you have a limited number of turns before your opponent kills you. Here, that pressure is supposed to be applied to the time that you have, the cooldowns, right? However, because there is no global cooldown on moves, it is not a sacrifice to use a bad move since you can just use a good one immediately after. There is no time loss, even more so when you switch out after attacking to a new Pokemon and all their moves are then available. If you had a global cooldown for moves or just limited move access for a couple of seconds after switching, that would require the player to think about if switching is a good idea, but as it stands, switching was a penalty in previous games and now is no longer a penalty. There are also no abilities in the game due to the fact that most of the abilities relied on the turn-based system to work. Unfortunately, what that means is that setting up things like move traps, where Pokemon would spawn into move traps, or having things like grounded or sand trap or other ones that would prevent them from switching, those things do not exist in this game. Items are pretty pointless since you can just open your bag in combat and heal whenever you need. I will mention though, however, they did the Digimon thing and prevent you from only using, or allow you to only use one item, which is a good change. However, it's also completely nullified by the fact that you can just flee battles whenever you want, including trainer battles. We'll come back to that. Team composition is not super important since you can just swap to a Pokemon with a highest damaging attack and not risk losing them, as again, it's not turn-based. You are not losing a turn and taking damage if you make a wrong call. Again, since you can run from wherever you want, you can run from the trainer battle. If you messed up, you can just run from the battle, open your box, get a new Pokemon, and try again. The free swapping, free running action combat means that while it is quick and technically satisfying, it destroys any semblance of strategy or fun that the game could have. What you're effectively left with is just the Pokemon, which due to their limited move pool and quantity of Pokemon means that that's not a compelling reason to play the game, especially when, as I remind you, there are no new Pokemon in this game. This is a Gen 6 game, or Gen 6 title, meaning every Pokemon is going to be from X or Y or before. So as far as, additions, unlike some other games like even Legends Arceus, there's no new Pokemon, no new variants, no new moves. The only thing you get that's a little bit different is some new Mega Evolutions. That is it. So to recap, if you are a little bit disjointed by the structure here, to recap, I have made this little title card here showcasing everything that's wrong with the game in a relatively numbered order list. So to recap, we have a game that has no world, barely any shops, houses, or environments, static characters, brain-dead Pokemon, no connecting anime or card game to broaden the scope of the game, no voice acting, no abilities, no danger, no fear of losing, no need for team composition, no need to strategize moves, no reason to use different items. You don't need to aim since there's a guy that literally gives you your Pokeballs back, so even if you miss a bunch, you're like, oh, no worries about that. You also don't need to worry about accidentally fainting a Pokemon before you can catch it, as it just auto-stuns when you kill it, so you can just catch it right there. There's no Elite Four for an ongoing challenge, there's no long-term goals, there's no endgame rebattles, there's no challenges that are set up, other than these weird platforming things that just suck. There's no Battle Frontier for endgame, there's no extra stories. And finally, for the 21st issue, if you can see it at the bottom there, here, let me flip it real quick. This is the most expensive Pokemon game in history at $70 US, not including the DLC. We will get to the DLC a little bit later. Every single thing I mentioned here was present in past games. This is not an old problem. This is a new now problem that Gamefreak has decided upon for this game. It's exclusively a list of problems that affect this game and pretty much nothing else, and it's abhorrent. On another note, I've been replaying Sword and Shield because I've been wanting a more traditional Pokemon adventure, and someone new to the series was asking whether the best place to start was. As everyone was recommending games like Arceus or the new game, I was sitting there dumbfounded because the best game to me was the one that gave them a more typical Pokemon experience. Assuming they don't have a 3DS nor an ability to hunt down previous games, the best one to start with is Sword and Shield. A typical format that gets them used to the battling, gym, and structure of the story and the setting. And I think it's worth noting. People forget, I've talked a lot about Arceus, I've talked a lot about ZA. Let's talk about some older games. Let's start with Sword and Shield. People forget, because it's been a while now, but Sword and Shield are the best looking Pokemon games by far, bar none. Vastly superior looking to Arceus or Scarlet and Violet or upscaled Sun and Moon or the new game. This footage you're seeing is, being replayed on emulator, mainly because I wanted to boost it up to 1440p and anti-aliasing, which the original game does not have. However, I did put about 75 hours into the game on Switch 1 for what it's worth. I would say that Sword and Shield has a lot of things, even in its more traditional format, that I think are still very exciting. Here's an example of how this game operates. Here's how you're introduced to the starters in Pokemon Sword. Now here's how you're introduced to the starters in Pokemon Legends Arceus. And then here's how you're introduced to the starters in ZA. You may have noticed a couple things. First off, the fact that the graphics seem to be getting worse for each entry, at least the Pokemon models. That's a little odd. The second thing you'll notice is a complete lack of attachment to the starters in the most recent game. Why is that? Because unlike even Sword and Shield, or even a little bit to what Arceus was doing, they don't bother showing any personality. There's no movie setup. There's no, hey, here's what these Pokemon are about. Here's their personality. Here's why you should care about them. Nothing. They just drop right on you. Here you go, and now you're battling, right? So that's disappointing, and it just goes to show you how, less care they put into that actual personality-driven world and feeling that the other older games had. In my opinion, Pokemon Sword also has a better art style that, while technically simpler than ZA, allows that cell shading and that shadow work to really shine, especially when it's upscaled. The fixed camera also lets you actually frame shots and have any kind of scene composition. The Pokemon models themselves are quite pleasant to look at, and while again simpler than something like Scarlet's models that have a little bit more texture to them, I would also say I kind of like those models that Sword uses more, because I think that's how Pokemon should look like. Scarlet and ZA models make them look a little bit more like plush dolls and not really creatures. Again, that's more of a personal preference, but it is something I noticed. The UI in Sword is actually themed and consistent. Scarlet, Violet, and especially ZA's UI are so sterile and generic they could be from any game you find off Unity, right? Well, coming back to the Pokemon Center, I didn't forget. In Pokemon Sword, the Pokemon Center is an actual shop with a background that you can see potions and items on the shelf, and the Healing Center actually has an area where you can see the models of the Pokemon being healed. An actual personality, an actual place and sense of where the things are in this game that the recent game doesn't have. In terms of endgame, Sword and Shield had pretty much everything in working order, and while the endgame was lacking, it did absolutely have one. You could still have team composition. You had raid battles that worked. It had a battle tree to grind out competitive items. You could rebattle the Elite Four. You could catch new Pokemon. It had an actual world to explore and go around in, right? The only one issue that has stayed consistent throughout all the games is no voice acting, which has only actually become a problem because Pokemon for some reason has demanded tutorials get longer and longer and stories get more and more involved. If they went back to what they were doing in 4 and 5, no one would be complaining about no voice acting. It's the fact that every single game adds more and more lines and more scenes that swear to God they should have been voice acted, and it feels very odd that they're not. But beyond the voice acting thing, everything else in the game and my issues with it has been pretty much exclusively from and for this new game. So I've spent most of the part 3 here systematically tearing down ZA, from its world design to its weak combat model that destroys what makes the Pokemon work, to its vicious personality void. And I'm almost ready to mention some positive things, but unfortunately I do have one more issue with ZA. The DLC, being technically day 1, to me is not an issue, since it's actually not day 1. The outfits are day 1, but the actual DLC is coming out before the end of February. If you are a Pokemon fan like me, you may know that the actual problem lies in the fact that there is something a little odd about it coming out in 4 months here. It's that it usually takes a lot longer. Historically, Pokemon's DLC is in the form of a third enhanced version that combines the previous 2 games, and some extra rework stuff about a year to a year and a half later. Pokemon Emerald for Gen 3, Pokemon Platinum for Gen 4, Pokemon Black and White 2 for Gen 5, Pokemon Ultra Moon and Sun for Gen 7. And all third versions of their respective generations games. They are sold for about the same price as the original game, and even if you don't like them, they at least give you a whole game for that asking price. Starting with Pokemon Sword and Shield with the Switch, they went with a typical expansion pass model. In this case, 2 DLCs, one released in March or April, and another released in October or November. There was no option to buy them separately. You need to spend the full $30 to get both of them in one package. It's a model that I would overall say works well enough to give the devs more time to work on another game instead of releasing another one after 1 year, right? You may notice a difference between that model and what we have here. If you're not familiar with the DLC for ZA Mega Dimension, I'll explain it real quick. Mega Dimension DLC for ZA is a single $30 DLC that releases in 4 months, about 4 months. The difference there is that unlike the other previous Sword and Shield or Scarlet and Violet DLCs, which were 2 smaller DLCs released roughly 6 months apart to create an entire year of Pokemon content, we have one larger, maybe, DLC for the game that releases in 4 months. That's a little odd, and it means, most likely, that we are also getting Gen 10 in 2026. This has never happened before. We've never gotten a DLC or enhanced version of a game and then another mainline game within that same year. At least to my knowledge, someone may be able to correct me, but at least looking at release dates, that has not happened. So this can tell us one of two things. Either this DLC is extremely rushed because they were focused on polishing the main game, I'm suspect, or the game itself was heavily delayed to the point where it made sense to only do one DLC and only focus on that. Possibly both of those things can be true at once. But the brass tacks is this. Considering the Area 0 size DLC for Scarlet and Violet was a decently sized first DLC and a substantially larger size second DLC for about $35, this Mega Dimension DLC needs to be at least 2 big zones, I would say, with a substantial amount of new Pokemon and mechanics, since that's what both Sword and Shield's Crown Tundra DLC did and Scarlet and Violet's Indigo Disc did. As a reminder, both of those DLCs were $15 or one part of a 2-part DLC pack. So the fact that I'm even comparing them should be a red flag. If all my hopes are for this $30 DLC is that it's just as good as a $15 DLC from Sword and Shield 6 years ago, there's a problem here, right? I guess in terms of a graph of worst to best, what are some other $30 DLCs? Well, on the good side, we have stuff like Liza P. Overture, and on the bad side, we have Starfield Shattered Space. So if you're aware of what those 2 DLCs are, contain, and have been received critically or review-wise, let's hope for somewhere in the middle, preferably near the Liza P level, not the Shattered Space level. However, I'm going to save judgment because the only info we have right now is that it will be similar to something like Sun and Moon's Portals or Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon's Dimensions. And this is basically where portals opened up in whatever era you have. It holds new Pokemon. You're able to battle, in Ultra Moon's case, the Ultra Beasts. You're able to collect them in their special containment. They have a little story that goes along with them, stuff like that, right? It's a decent idea. However, as I mentioned, it was already done previously in the Ultra or enhanced versions of Gen 7 Sun and Moon. I also want to note, in case anyone's a little bit confused on what those are, Sun and Moon, Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon, the enhanced versions are re-releases, similar to how Atlas does it, of an existing game with some tweaks to the main game. However, a lot of it is, expanded, reworked, that kind of thing. Important to note with these, they're full games. It's effectively the Sun and Moon slightly remixed with new stuff for the same price, in this case $40, that the original Sun and Moon was. And I think that's the thing. These enhanced versions we used to get were still the original games with new content. It wasn't just the new content. Again, I'm not going to try and judge it too much, but I did want to add a little bit more clarity for people that are not familiar. In my opinion, the DLC model is not inherently better than a separate third version for a discount model that they were doing, roughly speaking, in other times, right? I was able to pick up Ultra Moon for like $35 on Amazon, right? And that was like a pre-order. So like frequently speaking, even if they weren't on discount, they would be on discount quickly because they were the third version, a lot less interest, right? That kind of thing. All right, so before we wrap up here, I want to talk about some positives. There are some positives to this game, if you can believe it, to ZA. So one thing I really liked, Megas are back, and both in the combat and in their use, they are a pretty great addition and counterpoint to something like Arceus' horrible boss battles. They are exciting since you actually need to move around with your character to avoid attacks and use the combat options of your Pokemon to deal damage. This dealing of damage allows what are called Mega Energy to spew off of the Pokemon the one you're battling, which you need to collect with your guy and then be able to allow you to evolve. And especially what's really important is you also need to maintain that energy. If you do not collect these orbs within combat, you won't be able to keep your Mega Evolution. It's a great use of the fact that up until this point, which hasn't been utilized, your character and Pokemon in this game are separate entities. You can control your Pokemon, or Pokemon can do their own thing as long as you input the moves, right? But you are separate entities. You can get hit separately, you can be affected separately, which is something unique to this game that the other Pokemon games have not tried before, but up until this point hasn't really been much of an issue. However, with Megas being around, it now is actually being able to be used, right? The other positive thing I'll say about the game is how wild zones develop throughout the game. More zones get added later on into the story with new Pokemon as a result of both your game progress through the ranks as well as story development. It does add some reasoning for the zones, both in terms of story and what you do in them. Unfortunately, with everything else in the game, it's heavily compromised by the fact that the template for these zones are 3 options of circle, plaza, streetway, or apartments. But it is a step in the right direction when it comes to a more traditional world event sort of system. Overall, I hope that throughout this video, I've been able to do a couple things and shine light on some stuff. First one is how Pokemon got to where it is from both a games and a universe perspective. 2, why that ends up working in its favor with the games and the mechanics that they're in, especially where others have faltered for that. And 3, how absolutely disappointing and destructive it is that the new game does not realize that overall experience. To me, the new game has nothing. No attempts at feeling or a link, or that it even gives a shit. Other games may be seen as less effort, but I can't imagine any Pokemon game will be seen as having less soul. It's incredible how a relatively small set of changes fundamentally obliterates, to me, what makes a Pokemon game work. And unfortunately, that is where we'll have to leave this part of the video. In part 2, we'll be looking at the new Digimon game, why that one is able to nail both of the pillars of the subgenre as well as destroy Pokemon, and what it tries to do with a story-based monster catching game. So stay tuned for that. If you like this video and want to see other deep dives like this on the channel, make sure to subscribe for future videos. Comment below your thoughts, and I'll see everyone in the next video, and thank you for watching.